The 17th of January, 1940. Dessau, Germany. The cold air above the Junkers factory shimmered with exhaust. Ernst Heinkel stood on the tarmac, coat collar turned up against the wind, watching the Heinkel He-178 taxi into position. The aircraft looked wrong sleek where propeller planes were blunt, silent where engines should roar. When test pilot Erich Wasitz opened the throttle, there was no crescendo of pistons, no whirling blades catching light. Instead, a high-pitched shriek tore through the winter morning, and the jet history's first true turbojet aircraft clawed into the sky on a pillar of invisible fire. Heinkel permitted himself a thin smile. Germany had crossed a threshold. While the rest of the world still relied on propellers and reciprocating engines, machines fundamentally unchanged, since the Wright brothers, the Reich, possessed something revolutionary. The turbojet was not merely faster. It was a different form of flight altogether, a quantum leap in the physics of war. Within 2 years, Messerschmitt would have the Me 262 inches prototype, capable of speeds no Allied fighter could match. The Luftwaffe's engineers spoke in hushed tones about jet-powered interceptors that could shred bomber formations before the gunners even saw them coming. But on that same January morning, across the Atlantic in Buffalo, New York, a different kind of revolution was quietly unfolding in the offices of Bell Aircraft Corporation. Larry Bell, a pragmatic industrialist with a talent for turning wild ideas into flying metal, sat in a meeting with his chief engineer, Harland Poyer. On the desk between them lay a cable from Washington. The message was absurd on its face. Britain wanted to share jet engine technology with the United States. Jet engines. America didn't have jet engines. America didn't even have scientists seriously working on jet propulsion. The entire American aviation industry, from Curtiss to Lockheed to Boeing, was still perfecting the art of the supercharged piston engine, squeezing every possible horsepower from cylinders and crankshafts. "We're being asked," Bell said slowly, "to build a fighter around an engine that doesn't exist in this country, using blueprints from a British design we've never seen. For a type of propulsion our engineers don't understand." Poyer adjusted his glasses, studying the cable again. "When do they need it?" "Yesterday." It was not a joke. By early 1941, the war in Europe had become an engineer's nightmare. The Luftwaffe was fielding new aircraft at a terrifying pace, and British intelligence had confirmed that Germany was far ahead in jet development. If the Nazis achieved air superiority through jet-powered fighters, the whole calculus of the war would change. Bomber fleets would be slaughtered. Air cover for amphibious landings would become impossible. The Allies needed jets, and they needed them quickly. Britain had Frank Whittle's revolutionary W-1 turbojet, a brilliant design that had taken the RAF's engineers years to develop, but Britain lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce both Whittle's engine and an airframe to carry it. America had the factories, the resources, the raw industrial might, but no knowledge. So began one of the most audacious technology transfers in history. In the autumn of 1941, a British team arrived in Massachusetts carrying crated components of Whittle's engine. General Electric, not traditionally an aircraft manufacturer, was handed the blueprints and told to reverse engineer the device. Bell Aircraft, a company that had never built anything faster than 400 miles per hour, was assigned to create a fighter jet from scratch. Neither company had more than a theoretical understanding of jet propulsion. The entire project was classified under the innocuous designation P-59 Airacomet. Even the test pilots wouldn't know what they were flying until they saw it. What the American engineers didn't fully grasp yet was how completely jet technology would redefine aviation. For decades, aeronautical progress had been incremental better alloys, improved fuel mixtures, more efficient propeller designs. But the turbojet wasn't an improvement on the old paradigm, it was a repudiation of it. There were no pistons hammering in timed rhythm, no propellers converting torque into thrust. Instead, air was sucked into a compressor, mixed with fuel, ignited in a continuous explosion, and expelled at tremendous velocity. The principle was elegant, almost simple, but the engineering tolerances were brutal. Turbine blades spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute in temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Fuel flow calibrated to millisecond precision. Compressor stages that had to be mathematically perfect, or the engine would stall, overheat, explode. Bell's engineers worked in a sealed hangar in Buffalo, forbidden from discussing the project even with colleagues in adjacent buildings. Security was so tight that when parts arrived from GE, they came in unmarked crates under armed guard. Workers were told they were building an experimental high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The truth was compartmentalized. One team designed the airframe without knowing the engine specifications. Another team calculated thrust-to-weight ratios, using hypothetical numbers. A third team built the landing gear based on estimated weights that kept changing as GE struggled to finalize the engine's design. It was chaos masquerading as engineering. By the spring of 1942, GE had produced a working copy of Whittle's engine, designated the IA. It was a mechanical marvel and a maintenance nightmare. The early IA engines had a service life measured in hours before critical components had to be replaced. Fuel consumption was staggering. The thrust output was temperamental, varying wildly with altitude and temperature. Worst of all, no one in America had ever tried to integrate such an engine into an airframe. The Bell engineers had to invent solutions to problems they couldn't anticipate. Where should the air intakes go? How do you firewall an engine that runs at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit? What happens to control surfaces in airflow moving faster than anything we've tested? They built the P-59 anyway. In appearance, the Airacomet was a strange hybrid part fighter, part experiment, part educated guess. It had a conventional tricycle landing gear, a slender fuselage, and twin engines slung under the wings in streamlined nacelles. There was no propeller, no spinner, nothing at the nose but a stubby air intake and a pilot's canopy. When the first prototype was rolled out in September 1942, mechanics stood in silence, unsure whether to be awed or skeptical. It looked like a fighter from the future, or a toy someone had forgotten to finish. The test pilot was a lantern-jawed engineer named Robert Stanley, a man who'd flown everything Bell had ever built. Stanley studied the P-59 with the quiet intensity of someone calculating odds. He'd read the reports from Britain, knew that Whittle's test flights had been plagued with engine fires and compressor failures. The IA engines on this prototype were barely proven. If something went wrong at altitude, if the turbines disintegrated or the fuel lines ruptured, there would be no time to bail out, no way to glide to safety. Jet engines didn't windmill like propellers. When they quit completely. The 1st of October, 1942. Muroc Dry Lake, California. The high desert was a blank canvas of sun and silence. Muroc had been chosen for its isolation and its vast expanses of flat, hard lakebed, ideal for emergency landings if the jet proved unstable. Stanley strapped into the cockpit before dawn, running through a checklist that included items no American pilot had ever tested: turbine spool-up time, combustion chamber temperature, compressor stall warning signs. Ground crew stood at a distance, watching the twin nacelles with the nervous anticipation of bomb technicians. Stanley advanced the throttles. The engines didn't roar to life, they whined, a rising banshee shriek that climbed in pitch until it seemed to pierce the skull. Dust kicked up in twin hurricanes behind the aircraft. The P-59 lurched forward, accelerating faster than Stanley expected, and then it was airborne, rising on invisible pillars of thrust into the pale morning sky. For 13 minutes, Stanley flew circles over the lakebed, testing controls, feeling out the aircraft's personality. The P-59 was sluggish, heavier than expected, but it flew. When he landed, the ground crew swarmed the aircraft, checking for stress cracks, overheating, fuel leaks. Stanley climbed out, sweat-soaked, and delivered his verdict in 3 words. It needs work. That was the American way: build it, fly it, fix it. Over the following months, Bell produced 13 prototypes and 20 production models of the P-59. Each one was slightly different, incorporating lessons from the last. Engineers discovered that the IA engines were underpowered. GE responded with the I-16, which delivered more thrust but drank fuel even faster. Pilots found that the P-59's rate of climb was disappointing compared to conventional fighters. Bell redesigned the wing profile, shaved weight wherever possible, added more fuel capacity. The Airacomet never became the superweapon some had imagined. It was slower than the P-51 Mustang, less maneuverable than the P-47 Thunderbolt, and its operational range was laughable. But it flew, and in flying, it taught America everything it needed to know about jet propulsion. What the German engineers at Messerschmitt and Heinkel didn't fully appreciate was that the United States wasn't trying to win a race, it was trying to build an industry. The P-59 wasn't meant to defeat the Me 262 inches combat. It was meant to train pilots, test engines, refine manufacturing techniques, and establish a foundation for the next generation. By 1943, American factories were producing jet engines at a scale Britain couldn't match. By 1944, Lockheed had used lessons from the P-59 to develop the P-80 Shooting Star, a fighter that was faster, more reliable, and combat-ready. By 1945, the United States had leapfrogged Germany in jet technology, not because American engineers were more brilliant, but because American industry was more adaptable. The symbolic heart of this transformation wasn't a technological breakthrough or a brilliant scientist, it was a philosophy. The Germans built the Me 262 as a perfectionist's dream, a machine so advanced it required specialized alloys, exotic fuels, and months of meticulous assembly. Only 1,400 were ever produced, and most were grounded by fuel shortages or destroyed on runways by Allied bombing. The Americans built the P-59 as a prototype, a learning tool, a stepping stone. It was never meant to be perfect, it was meant to be possible. In the cockpit of a P-59, pilots experienced a strange dislocation from everything they knew about flying. There was no propeller vibration, no rhythmic hammering of cylinders, no smell of oil and exhaust. The throttle response was smooth, almost eerie push forward, and the aircraft accelerated with a steady, relentless pressure, as if invisible hands were shoving it through the air. Old-school pilots, men who'd flown Spitfires and Mustangs, reported feeling unmoored, disconnected from the machine. The P-59 didn't bark or growl or snarl like a piston fighter. It hummed. It purred. It felt less like riding a warhorse and more like being strapped to a bullet. And yet, in that strangeness, there was a revelation. The jet engine was democratic in a way piston engines never were. A radial engine required skilled mechanics, rare materials, precision machining, months of training to maintain. A turbojet was mechanically simpler, fewer moving parts, no complex valve timing, no delicate synchronization of ignition and compression. It was easier to manufacture, easier to repair, easier to mass produce. The United States, with its vast industrial base and its ethos of standardized production, was uniquely suited to exploit this advantage. Henry Ford had revolutionized the automobile by making cars cheap and plentiful. Now American aviation would revolutionize air power by making jets cheap and plentiful. By the time the P-59 program officially ended in 1945, the Airacomet had been rendered obsolete by its own descendants. The P-80, the F-84, the F-86, Sabre each was faster, tougher, more capable. But every single one owed its existence to the awkward, underpowered, pioneering P-59. Test pilots who'd flown the Airacomet went on to become jet instructors, passing down hard-won knowledge about compressor stalls, flameouts, and high-speed handling. Engineers who'd struggled with the IA engine went on to design the J-47 and the J-57, turbojets that would power America's Cold War arsenal. The factories that had fumbled through building 13 prototypes became the backbone of an industry that would eventually produce thousands of jet fighters. The Germans, for all their early brilliance, never made that leap. The Me-262 remained a technological marvel and a strategic failure too advanced for its own infrastructure, too fragile for mass production, too late to change the outcome of the war. When the Third Reich collapsed, Allied intelligence teams fanned out across Germany, seizing jet prototypes, interrogating engineers, cataloguing research. They found designs for swept-wing jets, rocket interceptors, engines more powerful than anything the Allies had fielded. But they also found factories destroyed by bombing, fuel depots empty, assembly lines silent. The Nazis had built masterpieces in a collapsing empire. The Americans had built production lines in the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. There's a photograph from October 1945, taken at Wright Field in Ohio, that captures the essence of this transformation. In the foreground sits a P-59 Airacomet, its twin engines cold, its fuselage dusty from months of storage. Behind it, gleaming in the afternoon sun, is a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, sleeker, faster, deadlier. And behind that, barely visible in the background, is a captured Me-262, its shark-like nose and swept wings a reminder of what the Germans had achieved. 3 aircraft, 3 philosophies. The Me-262, brilliant but brittle, a weapon forged by genius and crippled by scarcity. The P-59, imperfect but essential, a bridge between the old world and the new. The P-80, refined, reliable, ready an aircraft built not to impress but to dominate. The American approach to the jet age wasn't about being first, it was about being relentless. In the years that followed, the lessons of the P-59 rippled outward. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, American F-86 Sabres faced Soviet MiG-15 seconds in the skies over the Yalu River, the first jet versus jet dogfights in history. The Sabres won not because they were universally superior, but because American pilots had a decade of jet training behind them, mechanics had a decade of jet maintenance experience, and factories had a decade of jet production expertise. The MiG-15 was, in many respects, a better aircraft, faster at altitude, better climbing rate, heavier armament. But the Americans had an entire system. Supply chains, training programs, tactical doctrines, all refined through years of trial and error that began with the clumsy, underpowered P-59. This was the hidden genius of American engineering during the Second World War, not the ability to build the best weapon, but the ability to build a learning system. The Manhattan Project wasn't just about constructing an atomic bomb, it was about creating an infrastructure for nuclear physics research that would persist for decades. The Liberty ship program wasn't just about producing cargo vessels, it was about perfecting mass production techniques that would revolutionize shipbuilding. And the P-59 wasn't just about flying a jet, it was about building a foundation for an entire aerospace industry. There's a recurring motif in the history of the P-59 program, a small detail that appears again and again in engineering reports and pilot testimonies: the sound. Everyone who encountered the Airacomet remarked on it: the shriek of the turbines spooling up, the banshee wail at full throttle, the eerie silence when the engines were idling. Pilots described it as unsettling, mechanical, alien. Ground crews compared it to industrial machinery, factory whistles, wind tunnels. It didn't sound like an aircraft. It sounded like the future arriving ahead of schedule. That sound became a symbol. For the engineers at Bell and GE, it represented possibility, the proof that American industry could master technologies it had never touched. For the test pilots, it represented risk. Every flight was a negotiation with physics and probability. For the military strategists, it represented transformation, the understanding that air power was about to change in ways no one could fully predict. And for the workers in Buffalo and Lynn and Muroc, it represented pride, the knowledge that they'd built something no American had built before, something that would echo through the decades. By 1946, the P-59 was retired from active service. Most of the surviving airframes were scrapped, their aluminum recycled, their engines salvaged for parts. A few were preserved in museums, static monuments to a transitional moment. But the knowledge embedded in those aircraft, the thousands of hours of test flights, the engineering drawings, the maintenance logs, the pilot reports, became the bedrock of American jet aviation. Every supersonic fighter, every strategic bomber, every commercial jetliner that followed owed a debt to the ungainly, pioneering Airacomet. There's a larger truth here, one that extends beyond aviation. The P-59 story is a story about how democracies wage technological war differently than autocracies. The Nazis poured resources into superweapons, the V-2 rocket, the Tiger tank, the Me-262, each one a masterpiece of engineering, each one produced in numbers too small to matter. The Americans built prototypes, learned from failures, iterated relentlessly. They accepted that the first version would be flawed, the second version better, the third version better still. They built systems, not talismans. They valued adaptability over perfection. This philosophy was rooted in something deeper than pragmatism. It was rooted in a cultural faith in progress through trial and error, in the belief that failure is a form of information, in the democratic ideal that good ideas can come from anywhere and should be tested against reality. When Larry Bell told his engineers to build a jet fighter around an engine they didn't understand, he wasn't being reckless, he was being American. The expectation wasn't that they'd get it right the first time. The expectation was that they'd figure it out as they went. And they did. In the end, the P-59 Airacomet never fired a shot in anger, never downed an enemy aircraft, never earned a place in the pantheon of legendary fighters. But it did something more important. It proved that America could learn faster than its enemies could innovate. It demonstrated that the gap between "we don't know how" and "we've mastered it" could be measured in months, not decades, if you had the will to experiment and the humility to fail. When Robert Stanley climbed out of the cockpit after that first flight in October 1942, a reporter asked him what it felt like to fly a jet. Stanley thought for a moment, still processing the strangeness of it, the smoothness, the power, the absence of vibration. "It felt," he said, "like something we should have built 10 years ago." He was right, but he was also wrong. The P-59 arrived at exactly the moment it needed to, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. It taught American engineers how to build jets, American pilots how to fly them, American factories how to produce them, and American strategists how to deploy them. By the time the Cold War began, the United States had a 15-year head start in jet technology, not because it had brilliant scientists or visionary leaders, but because it had been willing to build something imperfect, learn from it, and build something better. The last surviving P-59 Airacomet sits today in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It rests on a polished floor beneath soft lights, its twin nacelles silent, its canopy closed, its landing gear locked in a permanent three-point stance. Visitors walk past it, often without pausing, drawn instead to the flashier exhibits: the P-51 Mustang with its kill markings, the B-17 Flying Fortress with its nose art, the F-86 Sabre with its MiG kill tallies. The P-59 sits in quiet dignity, a relic of a moment when America didn't have jet engines, didn't know how to build them, and built them anyway. There's a plaque beside the aircraft. It lists the specifications, weight, speed, range, armament, but it doesn't capture what the P-59 truly represented. It doesn't explain that this awkward, underpowered prototype was the first step in a journey that would take American aviation from propeller-driven fighters to supersonic jets in less than a decade. It doesn't mention the engineers who worked in secret, the test pilots who risked their lives, the factory workers who assembled components they didn't fully understand. It doesn't describe the sound, the shriek, the wail, the mechanical scream of turbines announcing that the world had changed. But if you stand beside that silent aircraft long enough, if you imagine the desert heat of Muroc and the roar of those early engines, if you trace the lineage from this stumbling prototype to the jets that would dominate the skies for generations, you begin to understand something fundamental about how America fights, how it innovates, how it transforms uncertainty into capability. In January 1940, Germany had jet engines, and America didn't. By January 1945, America had an entire jet industry, and Germany had ruins. The P-59 Airacomet wasn't the reason for that reversal, but it was the beginning. It was the moment when American engineers looked at an impossible problem, shrugged, and started building. It was the proof that you don't need to have all the answers before you start asking the questions. You just need the audacity to try, the humility to fail, and the industrial might to keep building until you get it right. The jet age didn't begin with a perfect aircraft. It began with an imperfect one, an ungainly prototype that few remember, that never saw combat, that history half forgot. But every time a fighter jet streaks across the sky, every time a commercial airliner carries passengers across continents in hours, every time a turbine engine spools up with that familiar shriek, the ghost of the P-59 is there. Not in the machinery, but in the philosophy. Build it. Test it. Learn from it. Build it better. That was the American answer to the question of how to wage technological war. Not with masterpieces, but with mass production. Not with perfection, but with persistence. Not by having jet engines in 1940, but by making sure that by 1945, no one would ever catch up. And they never did.